Hello, everyone. It's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day in the quarantine. Will you be my quarantine buddy today in this beautiful quarantine? I'm talking about New Zealand, culture of New Zealand, son. Let's first start off with the background and geography. So basically, it's two main islands, and there's 600 smaller ones. They're like kind of scattered around the coast. You don't really see them on this map. But there's that northern island and smaller island, and it's basically long, and narrow with a bunch of mountains, and it's just very mountainous. You could the long view perspective would be that it broke off from Australia, and there's kind of like that part of the ocean. There's like all these like pressures from the waves, so maybe like it got pushed together and created all these mountains. It's just a theory though. It's the last large habitable location, basically like in the world. So for a very long time, there was very few people that came there. It was very one of the latest places to be settled. So because of that, there was no human interference on the ecosystem. So there's like a really diverse biodiversity. It's a little repetitive. And there's all these animals there, and it has like a very interesting ecosystem. If you know about that one island, where like no one went to it, you really see like these. I don't know. It's just a very natural place. In 1280, Polynesians started settling, think like Hawaii and like that kind of area in the world, and basically they came over, and these are the Maori people, and they started settling, and then about like in the 1600s, basically this Dutch explorer came over, and there's a place I guess in the Netherlands called Zeeland, and he was like, oh, this reminds me of Zealand, and he started calling it New Zealand, and that's where its name comes from. It's a little weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The Maori have their own name for it. I can't pronounce it, but basically it means like land of like white clouds, which is a lot more pretty than just New Zealand. And what's interesting is there actually was really peaceful interactions with the United Kingdom. Basically, there's a Dutch explorer, but the United Kingdom were the people who ended up settling there the most and migrating there the most. And they actually had a really peaceful relationship with the Maori. And what ended up happening is the French tried to go to New Zealand for some reason. It seems a little, I don't know, hard. But basically, what ended up happening was the Maori didn't like the French. They were like, we hate the French. We see them as a problem. And the United Kingdom were like, we also hate the French. We don't like the French. And they were like, oh, well, we don't want the French to mess with us. So, can you protect us? And basically they were like, sure, we'll protect you. We hate the French, and let's be buddies. And they made them basically sign these treaties with like, their kings and whatever, that basically they would rule over them and protect them basically in exchange for that ability to rule over them. And they became a colony. With the indigenous people, this is probably the most distinct thing of New Zealand's culture, because if you really think about it, this is what makes them different. This is kind of like the people that really are of New Zealand and kind of dictated its history and what makes it unique, as opposed to something like Australia and other countries with European settlers. So they're called the Maori. And basically what ended up happening with them is that they were the main population, but the main three things that kind of like led them to becoming less of a strong indigenous force is disease. They weren't exposed to the same diseases Europeans had. And also they gave them muskets, and there were like tribal disputes, but with muskets, they were like, oh, okay, well, now I can just shoot the guy I have a disagreement with. So there was actually all these wars due to muskets, and that led to a whole host of issues with the population. The Europeans didn't feel bad about selling the muskets because they were like, oh, we get to make money. As well as there was all these Christian conversions, so they kind of brought them out of their culture and made them Christian. Today, it's still 16.5%, which in the grand scheme of things, I mean, you compare that to Native Americans, in the United States and other indigenous populations, is actually really incredible, and that's just who's indigenous, who like have a high ethnicity amount, like where like they actually identify as that. But there's tons of people where they are European, but they have like 30%, indigenous. Maybe like their grandfather, grandmother, or someone has that background. So that's how much is like actually indigenous, but it's kind of spreads throughout, and it's a bigger portion as a whole when you really think about it. The Maori language is spoken today, not a lot, and it was made official in 1987. Until then, it was kind of like under the rug. They didn't actually want to acknowledge it. They were trying to get rid of it and assimilate people, but they've kind of changed it ever since 1987 to have a policy where basically they allow this language to be spoken. There's television channels with it, and there's multi-language schools where they teach it, and it's become a lot more socially acceptable. What's also interesting is despite this early Christian influence and the fact that you had these Christian conversions, 48.5% of the total country is secular, and a lot of the indigenous people don't really practice their indigenous religion, and they kind of just choose to be a secular route, keeping traditions, but they don't really, practice it in a religious setting. And also, today, the Maori are still the main influence on culture after the 1960s, and I'll talk about that later. Food. Now, a lot of the culture incorporates Maori food. It's kind of just become a very cool thing because if you're in New Zealand, this is really the only place you're going to get this kind of food. There's other places that have Maori food, but this is really where you're getting that super raw, authentic Maori food. So if you're in New Zealand, I mean, you're going to want to eat this anyhow. Otherwise, go somewhere else, I guess. With basically what's around there, they're an agricultural country, but for the actual like meats, they have lamb. There's just tons of like sheep all throughout New Zealand. And then the other thing is they're right next to the Great Barrier Reef. They're an island nation, so there's tons of fish that's used. I mean, they use anything they can find their hands on. Now, in terms of the Maori method and this kind of tradition, there's this thing called hangi, which is basically they cook food using heated rocks in a pit oven. And it's basically like a geothermal cooking method, and they had all these geothermal cooking methods throughout their history before Europeans came with ovens and other technology. And it's very interesting, the fact that they use this like geothermal methods and they heat up stuff, and it's very natural, and it kind of leads to a different cooking method and things kind of tasting a little differently. They also ate moa, which is, if you ever have seen the movie Up, that's the bird from Up. And basically they ate these like really exotic birds. They've even eaten certain bugs. They all, they're just weird bugs that really only pertain to New Zealand. You wouldn't recognize them. But it's interesting. They have a really diverse kind of sense of what they would eat and what they would not eat. What's also really interesting is in Maori cuisine, they never developed alcoholic beverages. For as long as they were there, there's no alcoholism because, they didn't really have alcoholic beverages as part of their thing. Which is kind of interesting when you really think about it. Also today, what they do is they kind of use the cooking methods, but then combine it with like European foods and dishes. So you kind of get a blend of like some Maori stuff, but instead it's like done with European foods. And basically what this leads to is this really unique cuisine that you don't really find anywhere else. Movies. If you didn't already know, Lord of the Rings was shot in New Zealand. This is probably one of the biggest things that shows off the geography and kind of the culture and gets kind of New Zealand on the map in terms of other countries, because you're like, man, that movie was so pretty. I loved what Lord of the Rings looked like. Or Avatar, Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Samurai. And you're just like, where was that shot? New Zealand. Most media is foreign owned. Meaning like all, when they shoot this stuff or they have a media company there, it's owned by, a bigger conglomerate found in the United States or UK or a European country. Some of it is owned by the government, mainly more local stuff. But what's interesting is despite this, they have incredible free expression of the media, and the media isn't really riddled with, these economic problems. So they still keep it really free. They allow expression. There's been tons of movies set on New Zealand issues that kind of got spread throughout the United Kingdom. And what's interesting is Freedom House, which is a United States company, gave it a 97 out of 100 based on like freedom metrics, with the U.S. only at 86 out of 100. So what's really funny is they have these movies and this culture, and they're incredibly free, and they really allow for a lot of freedom of expression. And they allow their media to basically be able to talk about whatever they want to talk about, and there isn't as many biases and discrimination in terms of their media. Culture as a whole, this is kind of like them from a broader, big picture perspective throughout history. So what's interesting is they used to be a very rural focus with an emphasis on modesty and pragmatism. I mean, it was a really small country, and you had to go really far to get there, and there wasn't as much development, and it was really hard to get that development there. So there was this kind of rural sense of community where you're modest, you have a small house, you're practical, you take care of things on your own, you're very independent, and what's interesting is this kind of went away once after the 1960s came. Urban communities became larger with more diversity. You got more immigration, especially after World War II. Tons of people moved there to escape kind of the problems with World War II. And what we saw is like a lot of people coming over there and wanting to live a new life and to kind of get away from the stress of the world at the time. So you get a lot more diversity, and people started becoming a lot more expressive and, you know, trying to bring Maori culture back into the norm and not trying to assimilate it and not try to keep it under the rug. They were like, let's embrace what New Zealand's all about. Let's embrace the indigenous people. It was very interesting. Also, what really is cool is that their biggest exporter outside of movies is music. And it's because they were a colony, it spread to the UK and throughout the British Empire. So New Zealand kind of serves as this portion really of a bigger British influence of culture, and that's kind of the medium they go through. And New Zealand makes their own takes on stuff with Maori and then kind of spreads that throughout the British Empire. And due to the remoteness as a whole, there's a very independent and relaxed attitude where you see that what the New Zealanders have is that the sense that they're really isolated. So, you know, they're not doing as many traditional beliefs. They're one of the most secular countries in the world, and they're really progressive in so many different ways. And it's because they're far away from everyone. They don't have to deal with the pressures as many people. And even as a UK colony, it's not like India where there's tons of oppression. You know, they were very comfortable with the indigenous people the entire time. So what's interesting is you get New Zealand as this really relaxed, laid-back country that's really progressive, where they kind of do their own thing. They have some things they really like, and it's a very peaceful country when you really look at it. For questions, these will be posted to the forums, of course. I thought it was interesting, and this one I like to put out, is New Zealand is just based off the Dutch name. It kind of makes no sense why they kept the Dutch name when it's a UK colony. But what would you rather have it be named? I mean, whenever I heard the term New Zealand, I was like, where was the original Zealand? And to me, it seems like a very weird name for this country. It still kind of captures the uniqueness and remoteness with a name like Zealand. But what would you rather have it be named? Thank you. This has been Ryan Corner.